It's my pleasure to introduce James Breen. He studied at the University of Bristol at the vet school there, and in spite of that handicap, he's gone on to great things. His interest is very much in mastitis, and he's done a residency in production animal medicine, and he's currently dividing his time between dairy practice in Glastonbury, research and consultancy at QMMS, and also being a clinical lecturer at Nottingham. So he's going to take over and introduce the next speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm James. Thank you very much to Large Herds, Richard and Warwick, for inviting me here this afternoon to talk to you a little bit about mastitis. I am not from anywhere exotic. For the benefit of Gordy and others, I come from Newport, which is the South Wales version of Detroit, I suppose. Although I'm willing to bet we've probably got more nightclubs. I am a vet. I suppose I have very long arms and I played a bit of rugby, so options to do other things were fairly limited. I thought for the purposes of this afternoon that rather than just myself, I would bring along a farmer friend of mine. So I know Nick probably needs no introduction for some of you, but I will just ask him to say a few words.
Oh, thank you, James. Yeah, just for the benefit of those of you who have got your ears tuned into American accents, a bit of Welsh and a bit of Wiltshire now, so that would give the interpreters a lot to think about. I'm farming in near Devizes in Wiltshire. We built a greenfield site dairy unit in 2004 and expanded the herd up from about 200 up to 600. And it's family business, parents, myself, and my wife, and we rear all the young cattle, all the followers, just over 2,000 acres now, and yeah, we're fairly low labour and trying our best to make some money.
Thank you. So I need to stress that I'm not actually Nick's vet. I am in practice, but down in Glastonbury, so that gives me my day a week of doing some proper work. I do hold a lectureship at Nottingham, and some of the things that we talk about over the next 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so, I'm keen to point out that this is the sort of thing we're equipping our Nottingham students with. And I spend time with Quality Milk Management Services, which is a sort of laboratory-based consultancy. And I guess, as well as social evenings with Nick, this is how we sort of were introduced to each other. And a lot of the stuff that I've done around mastitis led to the development of what is the National Dairy Co-Mastitis Control Plan. So just a point about the Nottingham thing, both myself and my colleague Chris Hudson, who's in the audience, and Nigel Armstrong from the Dairy Centre, we're very keen on targeting those next generation of farm vets and the sorts of things we like to do, as well as the individual cow medicine, and Sophie at the top there, who's loving cows, but also bringing it very much to the herd health sort of role, the preventative, and working with real farmers and real herds in Leicestershire and Derbyshire. We make this quite a big thing of their final year. And the sorts of things that I'll talk about now, we spend time talking with the students, perhaps higher level stuff, you could argue, but things we feel are important to equip new graduates with. So going back to what Nick and I are going to cover, we stress that this isn't an exhaustive list, but what we want to do is share with you perhaps some of the things that we've highlighted as being important in terms of a progression over about the last 6 or 7 years as to where Nick was, as to where he is now, and the sorts of things we feel are quite important in getting us there. Areas around data and the quality of that data, and then the emphasis on me trying to understand it and feed it back to Nick, and then being prepared to tweak and alter management, but in a very targeted way. So rather than a random shotgun approach of desperately changing all sorts of things in the hope that something works, very much a targeted approach, looking for some big wins. And we're going to talk a little bit about dry and calving cow environment before we move on into other areas. Another point we'd like to make is perhaps the sort of the role of using things like, beginning with something like mastitis as a springboard into other areas of herd health. So often it's quite interesting that this starts to drive some enthusiasm and some sort of willingness to do other things in other areas around fertility, disease management and the like. And I'll bring it back by saying, well, you know, we haven't forgotten the mastitis, and it's not a finished article, this, and we continue to monitor, and perhaps the role that the plan has around that. So perhaps, Nick, would you like to kick us off a little bit about your thoughts on data quality?
When we built the new dairy, we were grazing the cows as well, and we've been shut down with TB 17 years, and we were losing about 70 to 100 cows a year with TB. So I was trying to more than double the herd size, replace the TB reactors, and I was doing that by buying herds. And the data issues that we were getting was just a nightmare. The milk recording girls were coming in, and bless them, they weren't getting the data they really needed. We had duplicate freeze brands. We were finishing recording with 30 pots on the side, guessing which cows they belonged to, and something really had to change. And the best way I found of trying to get to grips with it was to do it myself. And we run the total system and moved to QMMS, and the biggest win of that to me was the fact that I ID all the cows at milk recording, my tractor driver does the yields, and we send it back, and at the end of recording we're absolutely confident that all the cows that should be in milk were in milk. If they're not, we find out where they were or what was going on. And it took a long time to get that data set accurate enough for James and Graham, the vets, to analyse that through with true records and true data. An example I think James put there was just to show we had cows there that were absent in milk recordings, we had cows that should have calved 50 days ago, and it was just a headache. So it took a long ball ache to get it right. Another thing on that, we're going on from one of the talks yesterday, there's never been a better time to look at replacement rate and look at buying more cows, and the last 3 or 4 weeks we've been trawling the country trying to buy some more. And the first thing we do is get a CDL file from the herds, look at their data set through Total Vet, see whether their calving pattern and everything suits what we're trying to do before we go and look at the herd. And the number of sets of data we had that were just so shocking, it's not even worth going to look at the cows, because you know they haven't been managed. And it wasn't until we got a really good CDL, we went and saw the herd, and we knew within 10 minutes of looking at the cows, they were the right ones to buy. And they're turning up tomorrow, which is why I missed this morning. We're trying to get organised. So it took a long time to get the data right, and James then started getting involved in about 2006, I think, when we moved across to QMMS. So you want to take it on from there?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So we had the data sorted out, and of course the onus is then perhaps on me to sit down with Nick and look at it in a very systematic fashion and try and understand from a mastitis point of view where the patterns in the data are. So where do new cases arise? Where do new infections as measured by cell count movement above a 200,000 threshold arise? And how can we then feed that back to management? So in terms of using the data, make no apologies for the fact that there will be a few slides that might upset a few people now. I know, sort of vets, students, consultants, looking at data and laptops tend to be quite frightening things, but it's very important that we can do this and marry up the clinical and the on-farm work with the ability to look at some information. And something like a headline mastitis rate is a starting point, but only a starting point. Not quite sure if the pointer's working. No. So we can see with Nick, this is year on year, so the green line is the previous 12 months, which is 2005. The blue line was the 12 months ending 2006. And Nick was rolling at around 80 or 90 cases per 100 cows per year, 2006, and this was increased compared to the year before. So, and what we know from the Dairy Co-Mastitis Control Plan work is that this is not unusual. And this is actually, unfortunately, quite common, and this would describe at least the top quartile, if you like, of herds, which would tend to live with 70, 80, 90 cases per 100 cows per year. But we need to do more than just look at a headline rate. We need to understand a little bit about the epidemiology. Where do these new cases come from? Never mind the recurrences so much. The recurrences are in red and green, but all I've done there is 18 months worth of mastitis cases ending June 2006, and done some colouring in, which it suits us because we're a bit thick. We like to use colours. So anything blue is a new case in that cow's lactation, which happened within the first 30 days after her calving date. And this is important because a lot of research work now, and some of it is 10, 12, 15 years old, and it's based in the UK, which showed very clearly that these cases are very likely to have arisen from infections that were acquired when the cow was dry, not after she started milking. So anything blue is a new case in the first month, likely dry period origin. Reds are recurrences of those cases. And what I wanted to sort of point out to Nick, I guess, was the importance of the dry period in terms of driving new clinical cases that were being seen in the next lactation. And taking that on one step further, Nick is an all-year-round calving herd, but clearly it'll vary. Some months there'll be more cows at risk than others. The blue line is the rate at which new cases within the first month are happening. That red line is some sort of happy place. Effectively, for every 12 cows that calve, will allow Nick to have one of them getting mastitis within the first month. But you can clearly see, this is going through 2006, that Nick was managing, unfortunately, more like 4 or 5 cases for every 12 cows that calved in the first 30 days. So a very high new case rate, very variable, but clearly producing a lot of mastitis into the next lactation, and very likely then running on into problems further along. If we look at his cell count, and this is the last one before we look at some pictures of the farm, we see a similar story. One of the key things is not just plotting bulk cell count and worrying about what my tank's doing, because it doesn't really tell you very much. The two biggest drivers of bulk cell count are what your culling rate are and what the stage of lactation is. It is a nonsense for monitoring. It doesn't mean anything. You could shoot 10 cows tomorrow and alter it. What you need to look at is new infection rates. The red line is the proportion of cows which, having been dried off with a low cell count, calve back round and have a high cell count at first test day. And Nick, unfortunately, again, is running at 20–25% of cows. So 1 in 4 low cell count cows or maiden heifers calving back round with a high cell count. Clearly an issue, and points us again to the dry period. And this is the sort of thing that you would do as part of the Dairy Co-Mastitis Control Plan. We were doing it 6 years ago, and the plan didn't exist then. But this first stage of sitting back and assessing herd infection patterns, moving away from some individual cow stuff for a bit, and looking for patterns in the data. And clearly the dry period was very important, and I wanted to sort of chat to Nick about current management and what he was doing, and ask him some key questions around what was going on around drying off, how it was being done, where it was being done. Yes, some questions about dry cow therapy, but then get into the meat of it about environment management. And we've heard a lot this morning from Gordy and others about how we're managing our cows, where they are, how long they spend, stocking rates, etc., and get some idea from Nick about what was happening. So Nick, could you run us through some of those key areas?
Well, back in 2005, 2006, when we hadn't long been in the unit, we were buying cows, we were under pressure with TB and everything else, and I'm just making excuses now. But we were tending to dry cows off on the platform. We're on a rotary, and we were drying them off as they were coming round towards the end of their lap, really. Sticking the tubes up them a bit quick, giving them a dip, putting them in the field, and hoping all's well. And after that, we realised that this wasn't the best way to be going about it. James actually was involved in doing quite a bit of study work at dry cow trials on the farm, and he came out on a Wednesday morning for about 2 years and taught himself and the Slovakians the protocol that we ought to be using for drying cows off, and we changed across to that. And again, we were running a one-group dry cow then in old buildings, overstocking and overcrowding. We had batches of 50 heifers coming in one go, which would put too much pressure on the dry cow housing. So we were looking at all those sort of things to try and relieve the pressure on that housing facility.
What about the actual hygiene around drying off? So what do you do now?
Now we got a brush that sterilises the cows when they come on with peracetic acid. We then use a piece of cotton wool soaked in surgical spirit, so we know the cows are clean. We double tube everything with a sealant as well as an antibiotic, and we do them one at a time in the order, post dip them and take them off. So there's a lot more attention and a lot more time put into each of the animals that are drying off. Run a 2-group system in the dry cows, which allows us to take the pressure off the straw yard. We're only serving 20 heifers at a time each month, so we're bringing them in steadier. It's basic management things that take the pressure off the calving yards.
What about the early dry period, Nick? Where were cows going? And
the early dries, we had an old set of buildings that we were putting those in, and we ended up ripping the centre cubicles out. They were on concrete beds with rubber mats. We ripped all that out and put in deep-filled wood chip beds, which is what we use in the main herd. Gave them a loafing area on the bottom side there. We made an outside yard, just gave them a lot more room, and managed them like the milking cows rather than discarding them out the back like we always used to.
So what about then, you've alluded to a straw yard, what about moving them into transition?
One of the problems that came up with the data, we were getting a lot of heifers that we were breaking in the first 30 days. So we split the straw yard into two. We keep the heifers one side, which we still do. So we're carving them in uninfected, technically, or cleaner beds. And we move them from the pens from the yard into the calving pens, so they're not mixing with cows. Bedding up once or twice a day with a straw chopper, and just keeping the stocking density down. All the basic things, as I'm sure you guys were already doing.
What sort of things were you doing, though? You're being sort of
not quite
a
as
bit
good as
modest.
that.
So what sort of things were you doing?
We didn't have a straw chop. We were shaking straw out with a JCB in lumps. You know, the straw wasn't sheeted properly, and we were overstocking those yards. Heifers mixing with cows. It was all the things when your focus isn't on it was happening. So yeah, we drew our attention to it when we realised how much it was costing us.
So in summary, I think we'd like to make the point that clearly you can see there's a cumulative effect. So it wasn't one or two things. We didn't suddenly use a different antibiotic or shoot a few cows. There was a targeted approach to changing within the constraints of the system. So Nick didn't throw up a new shed or suddenly dramatically alter something he was doing. But within the constraints of the system, there were some things around drying off. So getting the cows back round, pre-dip, dry wipe, surgical spirit swab, as Nick said. Addressing the early dry cow cubicles, which I think we agree were not good, and certainly for this herd and this yield, much more like the milking cows, more space, and I think loafing space is massively underrated for a number of things. And the transition yard, they were bedded 2 or 3 times a week. Nick is now bedding them daily, and there's things about cleaning out and stocking density, and as Nick says, sort of shorten the dry period slightly. And to make sure that we tried to stagger them through, and actually he created 10 carving boxes. So they used to carve on the yard, they now do not carve on the yard, they carve in separate carving areas. So clearly a lot of things, but what happened? Okay, so the headline mastitis rate, we're now into 2008. Here, this is 2009, and into the early few months of 2010. The red line is some sort of happy place, 25 cases per 100 cows per year. Doesn't really matter. The trend is downwards. So if you remember, we were 70 or 80 in the year before. Coming into 2008, we're 50. 2009, we're about 35, 40. And into 2010, we're down to around 25 and 100 in a year. But of course, why? He could just keep shooting cows. It doesn't tell you why. The key thing is we need to focus on new case rates. And when we focus on the first case rate within the first 30 days, you can now see what we're talking about. He used to run at about 4 or 5 new cases within the first 30 days after calving. That's at 1 in 12. We're now at or less than 1 out of every 12 cows calving down with clinical mastitis in the first month. That's what's driving the overall case rate down. If we stop calving down broken cows, the quickest way to reduce recurrence, for example, is to not have as many new cases. So rather than focusing on a little group of recurrently persistent clinical cows, we've dropped the new case rate.
I think the important thing out of that, James, was that because of the involuntary culls we were having with TB and yonis, which we'll pick up in a minute, I couldn't afford to lose cows through mastitis and cell count. And by doing those control measures, I honestly didn't kill cows with mastitis and cell count because I couldn't afford to. My culling rate would have been atrocious. So it was looking at ways that we could reduce the culling, and it didn't cost us a lot of money to do those changes. It's just management.
Good point, and it's meant that this picture is up for a few minutes longer than it probably should have been. But this is my "but don't forget" slide. Of course, it doesn't mean we then stopped, because one of the things we need to then say is, well, we've made changes in that area, and it may now mean that other things become more important. So it's a bit of a, well, what about milking cow management? What's going on here? And again, rather than have a wander around and a point at what I don't like the look of, this is using some data. Again, apologies about the green colour, but this is now looking at the rate of new cases that come after the first 30 days. So cows that have sailed through the first month absolutely fine, and then fall down with a new case of mastitis afterwards. This line is at 2 in 12, but it's more where the green line. So this is Nick's rate of new cases out in lactation. These are summer months, where the line suggests that the new case rate is elevated. These are winter months, where we don't do too bad at all. And these are summer months again. So you can now start to see what's happening out in the milking cow groups appears to be very seasonal. And there's some issues here around how this is a good example of an evolving pattern. You make some changes, well, now the lactation issues perhaps become more important. We haven't got that massive influx of infection pressure coming out the dry period anymore, so what happens out with the milkers is going to be of more emphasis, if you like, on the overall disease pattern. And actually what happened then, this is now sort of 2010-11, the Dairy Co-Mastitis Control Plan as it is now was up and running. Nick did this with his vet, and there was some emphasis now on what happens from the milking cows, given that we've got a seasonal pattern. So this is nothing to do with the parlour. We're not taking the parlour to bits. This is clearly something around what happens in the summer. And this could be bedding related, environmental pathogens, that sort of thing. And it flagged up, we need to talk about cubicles and pre-milking routine and other things. So perhaps, Nick, you could run us through these things now.
Well, it was around about this stage that, yeah, we did the Dairy Co-Mastitis plan, and the practice employed a new grad, Lucy, who looked like a progressive kind of vet. So it was around about then we got married, and I thought the advice could be useful, and it's cost me a fortune ever since, I can assure you. But we went through what we were doing in the dairy cows and in the milking routine and in the management of the cows whilst they were in the dairy unit. If you click on to the next one.
Yes, of course, mate, sorry.
So we decided to split the cows into 4 groups because the building's designed really for 430 or 40 cow groups. Group 1 was all fresh heifers, Group 2 fresh cows, Group 3 pregnant animals or animals running with a bull that are 150 days not pregnant, which allowed us then to use Group 4 for anything with a cell count above 200 or a chronic cow that had several 200s, and generally they were late lactation pregnant animals as a rule. That worked well for a while. We then ran into issues that when you got your milk recording data back to try and regroup those cows, it was just a nightmare to try and calculate which group which cow should be in, and it was proving a headache. We were on sand beds because everybody told me sand beds were the best, and when I went out to the States looking at dairy units in 2003, the best herds were on sand. But sand, as most of you know, is extremely expensive. And I was being stingy on it, and a poorly managed sand bed is worse than anything, I think. So I moved across to wood fines, which was about 1/3 of our bedding cost per cow per year. We're on flood wash system as well, and sand isn't a great fan of flood wash if you haven't got huge lakes and lagoons out the back. We were burning through pumps, so we looked at that, and then we looked at the bedding. We were bedding sort of every 4 to 5 days rather than regularly, and we got a rake on the tractor which allows us to level the beds and put a bit of fresh bedding on the back every day. So there's all kind of variables there, and to point your finger at which one was causing the problem is very difficult. The actual milking routine on the rotary, I had 4 guys on the parlour as well, which was expensive on the labour costs. I had 1 guy stripping and foaming, 1 guy dry wiping, 1 guy cupping up, and then 1 guy post-dipping. Belt and braces, and technically, you know, everyone thinks that's a super setup. We were great at picking up the cases, but we were picking up too many. So we've since looked at different ways of doing it. We bed up now every other day. We rate the beds every milking, so they're always on fresh wood chip at the back. We're flood washing 6 times a day, and we had one of these crisis meetings back in April, a bit like one of the speakers yesterday said, that you think you get your profit and loss out, you say, right, we're going to cut our costs. And at the end of that meeting, I ended up phoning the bank manager and wanted another 300 grand. Because we put in a SaniCleanse system for the cows, we put in heat time vocal, we bought another herd of cows, and invariably the way to make more money is to spend more money, as much as daft as it may seem. And we put the SaniCleanse brush in, which I'm sure some of you guys probably use, and it's an electronic brush that's brushing the cow's teeth with paracetic diluted with a cleansing product in there as well, which has cut a man out of the routine, and it's, well, you'll see the figures later, it's vastly dropped our clinical mastitis as well. So there are lots of different things that we then looked at and tweaked on the routine to make life better.
And I think just to finish that section off, it's actually Nick takes a very hands-on approach. He's being quite modest, but you do every morning milking. And so we know that clinical mastitis cases, if present, will be picked up because there is an identification every morning. And it's the importance of the pre-milking teat prep. You know, that actually whether it was going to be a foam and a wipe, and I take Nick's point absolutely about the labour costs, or whether it's a move to a sort of a sort of motorised, you know, labour-saving device, the aim actually with anything to do with the parlour routine and environmental mastitis is a proper pre-milking teat disinfection routine.
The danger with the system we were running is the afternoon and night milk is done by 4 Slovakians. And with the foam, if you put a lot of foam on a cow's teat, it took a lot more wiping off. And I knew on the night milkings there probably wasn't a great deal of foam going on there, so it was easier to wipe the cows off. With the brush, it's a simple protocol which is on the cow's teat and off the cow's teat, and it cleans the cow's teat. So from my point of view, when I haven't got skilled labour down there in a night milking, I know it's still being done properly.
Good point. Okay, so we wanted the next section to be really this idea of a springboard towards other areas of herd health and how mastitis can often lead you down other avenues. And so, Nick, back to you for a minute. Perhaps you'd like to lead this one?
Well, I think it was around about here we got back from honeymoon and I was getting earache because we had our copy of Total Vet and we were finding everything else that was going wrong as well. Yonis, as you can imagine, with the culling rate I was having, with the increasing and buying animals in, expanding the herd, it was a time bomb waiting to happen, which happened. And we'll talk a little bit more about Yonis, or James certainly will do in a bit. But 6 years ago, we started the Yonis control plan, which we're moving into. BVD was the next one to get our teeth into. We were vaccinating, but we were getting high levels on bulk milks. So about 8-12 months ago now, Lucy had a chat with Herschel. We went through the BVD eradication route. We blood tested 1,400 animals on the farm. Everything under 30 days we ear notched, and we took out about 9 PIs, I think it was. We were then still getting a low level on milks, which seemed odd, so we continued ear notching, and we pulled up 2 more PIs actually on calves, blood tested the dams, and sure enough, they were PIs. So we had 2 that slipped through. So if you do go through this route, don't think the blood testing is everything. You've still got to check your bulk milks and continue keeping an eye on it. But we'll continue ear notching the calves, and we'll continue vaccinating. I say I've got this herd coming tomorrow. The intention is hopefully to keep the herd closed at this point. So I've got a lot more heifers coming through the pipeline as long as we can keep TB at bay. And I also mentioned fertility management, also mentioned that the heat time vocal, we were 8 or 9 years we've been using a tail paint system on the cows, and the fertility had been ticking on okay. But the advantage I found to moving across to the heat time vocal wasn't just the activity and the heat detection at all. The actual knowledge of knowing how your cows are ruminating. We put a collar on every single cow. We went hell for leather on it. So we know exactly how our fresh cows are cutting, our dry cows, our late dry cows. We can pick up signs of ketosis or DAs before the cows go clinical, and with the Yonis positives as well, you see the cutting rates drop off before the cow goes clinical, is a huge benefit. So it's like I say, sometimes spending helps you save, as mad as it may be.
Good. Just to touch back on this Yonis thing, and some quite interesting comments earlier on, actually. I think the Yonis disease is one of those things that you tend to start to panic about when you work through things related to mastitis or fertility, and certainly questioning Nick around dry cow management and calving cow management, you could see that there were going to be problems. And of course he's got all the risks for it, having brought cows in and rapidly expanded the herd. And so we began Mycobacterium ELISA antibody screening back in 2008. And of course, yes, I appreciate there are some comments about the test is crap. It's not crap, you just have to be careful how you interpret it. And the key thing is you don't test to shoot cows. You test cows to risk manage. That's all you're doing. You're stacking the odds a little bit to know who is likely to be infected, and therefore it's not that they have to go, it's just that we do something a little different to them. And it's also very important to say the vet was heavily involved. And what we were aiming to do was to get some idea of the apparent prevalence. So back in 2010, we had about 20% of the herd apparently antibody positive, either on one or several tests, or uncertain, because antibody, you will get false positives, and it will go up and down a little bit. But the key thing now is that we're into, as Nick says, sort of, well, not quite 6 years down the line, but the prevalence has apparently halved, and we know we get about half as many first lactation heifers calving down and going antibody positive on milk testing. So the changes are starting to filter through. But as you know yourselves, and there's plenty of literature around this, you can be looking at 10 years, at least, down the line of managing this. But what interests me is often with Yonis and cell count is they're often perhaps different things. People are very used to looking at individual cell counts for cows, but perhaps don't look at the herd picture as much. Yonis is the opposite. We like to know how many Yonis positive cows we might have, but we don't really do anything about the individual cows themselves. So, Nick, what do you tend to do with a list of antibody results for these?
Well, because we're TB testing every 60 days, it's a bit of a nightmare doing the Ionis testing because you can't do it within the 60 days of a TB test. But we aim to do 3 to 4 tests a year. Anything that comes up provisional positive, we stick 1 red ankle strap on it. A double positive has 2 red ankle straps and a red ear tag. And the first signs of that animal going clinical, either with the tail off on rumination or dissolving on the back end, or I'm sure you know the signs. I have a slot with the abattoir every Tuesday morning and she's on the trailer and down the road. We also fetal sex every pregnancy at 60 days, so we know the ones that are carrying bull calves, so it helps make decisions sometimes on the positives. But we don't actively, we've looked at it several times with the other James Husband, the nutritionist. We looked at the feasibility of wiping all those Ionis positives out and buying in to replace. But it's a case of managing them and keeping an eye on them and targeting them. So we haven't actually directly killed cows because of it until they go clinical. But the protocol we put in place was obviously the provisionals or the double positives are carved in separate pens, dump the colostrum, we don't feed it. And it was actually, I blame Rotovec as much as anything, because we were pooling colostrum and feeding this colostrum to all these calves, thinking we were protecting them from Rotovec, and we were busy contaminating them with Ionis. So we put all the calves in individual hutches and manage them in that way. And our prevalence in heifers, as James was saying, is actually only it's dropped by about 70–80% on first calvers coming in now. So it's going to take 10 years to get it under control, and I think we're another 5 years to go until we're really comfortable with it.
This key thing about carving the cows somewhere different. Everybody worries about the colostrum and everybody forgets about the fact that they will pass the bacteria in the dung and contaminate large areas of dry cow yards and calving areas for other cows. Okay, so we've only got 5 minutes. That's a bit quick, but we are on the last section. So those areas aside, of course, we keep the mastitis going. We don't forget about it. So monitoring mastitis, I mean, what next? What's happening at the moment? Nick alluded to the figures at the moment. To give you some idea, in the last 3 months, he's had 11 clinical cases. So that as a rate, an all-case rate is 9 per 100 per year, extremely low. It will go a little bit up. But it may well stay much lower than it has been before. But what I hoped I've given you a flavour of is that what drives his clinical rates and what drives his cell count are 2 very different things. What drives the clinical cases is what happens to the lactating cows, and in particular the lactating cow environment. And we will have issues around the summer, around bedding, because, like Nick said, he wanted to use sand, he can't. We will have better pathogen survival when it's warmer, when it's more humid, and we will have issues around that. And there's the variations with things like the flood wash, for example. But this is extremely low. What drives his cell count, and he'll be first to admit that this is less well controlled, and we're running at about 240-ish, is the fact that actually this tends to come out of the dry period. So we know cows don't calve down and get clinical mastitis in the first month, but we still have this business of too many calving down with a high cell count. And it's a classic pattern you often see, very E. coli-driven clinical case things with the milking cows, very strep ubris cell count issues coming out of straw yard environments in the late dry period. And to give you some idea, I panicked slightly last month because Nick is running at 39% dry period new infection rate. So 2 in 5 cows being dried off low, coming back round infected at first test day. So this is wonderful, that perhaps isn't, but it gives you some idea of the early warning system. And I will look at things like this, but it's variable. This is this proportion calving down with a high cell count. It was as low as 1 in 10 low cell count cows dried off, coming back round high. That was the new year. And between February and now, we've gone from 1 in 10 to 2 in 5. Why? This is the sort of thing we need to look at. We need to know now, not when his bulk cell count's suddenly 300 in a few months' time, but knowing now. Is it some heifers that have come in and carved down high cell count? Is it we've forgotten to clean the yard out? Is it the straw quality? Is it the stocking rate? These sorts of things, you know now something is starting to go wrong. And this is one of the key things around the Dairy Cow Mastitis Control Plan, this idea of monitoring. We've done a lot, and we've gone a long way, and very impressed. You know, it's taken Nick 6 years, but I think these sorts of things do take a long time. Where he is now puts him in a very, very good position and shows it can be done, but there's still be issues that we need to monitor. So in summary, I think we are now at time. What we feel is important, and particularly with large herds, because things will happen very quickly the more you've got, and this emphasis on looking at data. You need robust data. 6 years ago when I met Nick, he had a database. It was all over the place slightly, and I know, his focus was on other things, but he grabbed it by the balls and sorted it out and trusted himself to sort it out and get the data right. And then we can use it to understand disease pattern on farm. And then we need to constantly reprioritise, have a little look, make a few changes, go back to the data, have another little look, go back to the data, and tweak and tweak and tweak, and do it together. There's a real team approach at King's Play, which is very nice to see and very important. And then we regularly monitor key parameters like new case rates and new infection rates, and these are the key elements of the dairy co-mastitis control plan and what it's become. So this is a little plea from us, I guess. Don't just talk about it, do it. And do it and apply it in real life. And this is a good example of where you can apply these things in real life. We'd like to, between us, acknowledge the help of Lucy, Graham, James, Summit, and the staff at QMS. And if we have some time for some questions, we'd be delighted to take them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, on your behalf, I'd like to thank both James and Nick. I thought that was an excellent presentation. And I was looking at the title of the talk being a unified approach to controlling mastitis, and I think that was a unified approach to doing a really good presentation. And thank you very much indeed for your time. There could be a question if somebody has got a question for either the guy. Yeah.
When you first had your high levels of clinical mastitis, did you consider using StartVac vaccine? Obviously, you didn't use it. If you did consider using it, why did you not use it?
Well, we did use it, but as part of a trial, and we didn't continue using it because on our herd it didn't make a great deal of difference. Obviously, other herds it might make a difference, but we didn't get a response from it. We used it quite heavily for 18 months.
Yeah, so we have used it, but at QMS we tend to use, and those of you that do sort of research trials with us, once we know where you live, we tend to sort of grab people. We grab Nick.
James, are you on?
Oh, sorry.
I'm not sure you're on mic.
We grabbed Nick for actually 3 dry cow therapy trials in the last 5 years, 2 dry cow antibiotic trials, and 1 with mastitis vaccine. That ran for 18 months. So it's the first UK randomised controlled trial. Results are being written up now. They are in the public domain. Andrew Bradley presented them to the HIPRA Mastitis conference back in April. And the headline findings were for us in the herds we trialled it in. So we had 3 treatment groups, if you like, within each herd. So we had cows that didn't receive vaccine at all, cows that received vaccine on label, drying off, calving into early lactation, and cows vaccinated on a rolling 3-month basis. The headlines were that the clinical mastitis rate was not significantly different between the 3. The cell count in terms of new infection rates weren't either, but what it did do, and was a significant finding, was reduce the severity of clinical cases. So cows were 2/3 the odds of a grade 2 or grade 3 case, i.e. swollen udder, stroke, sick cow. We also had, which is quite interesting, and we still can't probably explain this yet, a yield effect. So cows in vaccination groups, but interestingly, what I'm talking about, severity and yield, they only apply to those vaccinated on label. So anybody doing it rolling, fine if you want to, but you will lose the effect, or a significant effect, in reduction in severity and yield. But if vaccinated on label, cows were giving, on average, about 100 litres more in the first 120 days. That appears to be independent of clinical mastitis and cell count variables, where we factored in other things around cell count at drying off and mastitis rate, etc. So I guess the bottom line, or the message coming out to start with, at least anyway at the moment, is I would use mastitis vaccine based on clinical need. So herds that are experiencing a high level of severe clinical mastitis. Nick was not one of those. And you could suggest that the outlay in vaccine costs would be recouped by an increase in yield. The yield thing is variable, so of course Nick had the advantage of knowing exactly what his yield increase was. It was not as much as some other herds, likely probably because there was other things going on in Nick's herd. But yes, we have made him do certain things around dry cow therapy and vaccination, but I think what I'd bring it back to is while they can have an effect, and maybe in some herds they do have some effects, it's usually, and certainly this was no exception, outweighed by the environmental management, and that's certainly what we saw here.
Thank you very much indeed. Everybody, if we could maybe take a break at that, and thank you very much again, both of you. Tremendous presentation.